The man known to history as Joseph Désiré Mobutu was born on the 14th of October 1930 in Lisala, a city situated on the banks of the river Congo. His mother was Marie-Madeleine Yemo and would later be known as Mama Yemo. As a young woman already raising 2 children from a previous relationship, she was asked by her aunt, who was in a childless marriage with a local village chieftain, to join her husband's harem in accordance with a local tradition that gave the man the right to bring in a more fertile replacement. Unlike her barren relative, Yemo gave birth to twins, but when the newborns died after a short while, she suspected her aunt of witchcraft and fled to Lisala. There she met Alberic Gebemane, a cook working for a Belgian judge with whom she fell in love, marrying him 2 months before Mobutu was born. Joseph would later become known as Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngubendu Wazabanga, which translates to the all-powerful warrior who goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. He was part of the Ungubandi tribe, a small ethnic group which lived in one of the least accessible areas of Africa, a subsidiary branch of the River Congo called Ubangi that now straddles the border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Central African Republic. At the time of his birth in pre-independence Congo, the Ungubandi were seen as primitive and backwards by city dwellers, a stereotype that so embarrassed Mobutu he would dedicate much of his energy to changing it. Over the course of his life, Mobutu had 2 wives and several mistresses. In 1955, as an officer in the colonial force publique, he married his first wife, Marie Antoinette Gabia Tibwa Gogbe Yetene, who bore him 9 children before her death from heart failure in 1977. And then in 1980, he wed a former mistress, Bobby Ladawa, who gave birth to 4 of his children. During these marriages, Mobutu was unfaithful, complicating his marriage by taking his wife's identical twin sister, Kosia Ladawa, as a lover and fathering 3 children with her. This was such an open secret that during his public appearances, many Congolese couldn't tell whether it was Bobby or Kosia on his arm, giving rise to the belief that the polygamous arrangement was a good luck charm designed to ward off his first wife's angry spirit. Aside from Kosia, Mobutu took several women married to high-ranking officials in his administration as paramours, producing with them an unknown number of offspring. In appearance, Joseph Mobutu was a tall man who barked orders with a distinctive gravelly voice, and on rare occasions when he appeared in public, he was always seen wearing his signature leopard skin hat and buddy holly glasses and wielding an intricately carved cane. Referred to by European observers as the mild-mannered colonel, he was a leader of exceptional charisma, characteristics he took advantage of to manipulate those around him. Behind the charm, he was a calculating social chameleon, able to personally tailor his temperament, disposition, and mannerisms to the individual or situation at hand if it gave him a better chance of getting what he wanted. Like a trained actor, he could be furious one moment and then several minutes later change completely if he thought it was the right thing to do. Combined with his incredible memory, which enabled him to recall the name, profession, and tribal affiliation of anyone he had ever met, however brief the encounter, Mobutu's magnetism was a force of nature that allowed him unparalleled political power. Tempered with his assertive personality was a sardonic sense of humor that only sharpened as he aged. He was deeply narcissistic and at the apex of his powers insisted he be referred to as the leopard, a request that was reinforced by the distinctive roaring big cat printed on the country's banknotes. Towards the end of his reign, having driven Congo to ruin, the leopard became known as the dinosaur, in common parlance. At the time of Mobutu's birth in 1930, Congo was subject to the cruel and bloody rule of the Belgian government, who in 1908 had acquired the Central African territory from none other than their own monarch King Leopold II. From 1885 until the handover, the entire country had been the private property of the Belgian sovereign, who, from the comfort of his Brussels palaces, presided over one of the most abusive colonial regimes on record. Leopold bled the country dry of its valuable rubber and other resources, using slavery which his officials framed as indenture. Harsh measures included hands being chopped off as punishment if the enslaved didn't meet their daily quotas. The Congolese fared no better under the thumb of the Belgian government, who continued the practice of forced labor and the large-scale exploitation of the populace. At the time of Mobutu's birth in 1930, Congo was experiencing a considerable upsurge in native resistance, with sporadic armed uprisings becoming an increasingly common occurrence. In contrast to most Congolese of the period, though, Mobutu had a rather privileged start to his life when the wife of the Belgian judge his stepfather worked for took a shine to him. She treated him like her own child, holding his hand in public and teaching him how to read, write, and speak French fluently, in an exceptionally uncommon arrangement for the time. This lasted until he was 8 years old, when the death of his stepfather forced the judge and his wife to release them from their service, initiating a turbulent period in which his family moved around the country, relying on the generosity of relatives to keep them sheltered and fed. Transitioning from childhood to adolescence, Mobutu became a working man, helping in the fields while at the same time attending various missionary schools ran by Belgian priests. Here Mobutu's Christian faith was nurtured and strengthened, but like most others, his self-proclaimed belief in a single God did not stop him from believing in traditional African polytheism, illustrated by his later dependence on the advice of witch doctors. Mobutu's peripatetic existence finally came to a close when he settled down with his uncle in the modern-day town of Mbandaka, which was then a colonial administration center called Coquilletteville. In moving in with his uncle, he was following a time-worn African custom in which the children of rural relatives moved in with their family based in the city, who were then expected to pay for the upkeep and education of their young charges. More mouths to feed, however, meant a larger burden on already limited resources, and so life was quite tough for Mobutu, who grew used to a household of austerity and poverty, an experience that may partly explain his later tendency for excess and overindulgence. In his new home, he attended a school ran by white priests, where, because of his above-average size and intellect, he excelled at sports and academics, regularly featuring as one of the top 3 performing students. In fact, later in life, to teach his children about the importance of working hard at school, Mobutu summoned his old teachers to the presidential yacht to show them his flawless school reports. Outside of the classroom, though, and probably absent from the reports, he was known to be a troublemaker and joker that constantly stirred things up for the fun of it. One of his favorite activities was correcting the poor French of his Belgian teachers, whose mother tongue was Flemish, by standing up and pointing their error out to make his classmates burst with laughter, while another was to throw ink darts at his professors when their backs were turned to the blackboard. Because he was academically gifted, he was given leeway by his tutors. However, by 1949, their patience had run thin. For that year, Mobutu rebelliously stowed himself aboard a boat, heading for what many saw as a den of iniquity known as Leopoldville, the capital of Belgian Congo, that is now known as Kinshasa. Enamored by a girl who gave him his first sexual experience, he skipped school for weeks. By the time Mobutu returned, he had already been formally expelled and enrolled in the Congolese army against his will for a minimum term of 7 years. On the other hand, rather than ruining his future prospects, being sent to the Force Publique turned out to be a godsend, for it was there that he met his stern but affectionate mentor, Sergeant Joseph Bobozo, who instilled in the recalcitrant youth the discipline he so sorely needed. Throughout his service, Mobutu continued his education, voraciously reading and studying when performing sentinel duty, and perusing every newspaper or university publication brought over by his Belgian superiors from Europe. Here he developed a lifelong habit of reading and discovering some of his favorite authors, which included Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, and quite fittingly, Niccolò Machiavelli. whose 1532 treatise, The Prince, is widely regarded as an instruction manual for the budding autocrat. Encouraged by his bibliophilic tendencies, Mobutu switched his focus from accounting to journalism, landing his first job at a new pro-Belgian Congolese magazine, Actualité Africaine, where under a pseudonym, for members of the armed services could not express their political opinions, he began composing pieces discussing contemporary politics. Given the choice between continuing in the army or pursuing journalism, Mobutu chose the latter, and after a brief stint talent-spotting beautiful Congolese women for a raunchier section of the newspaper, he turned his hand to less frivolous matters as a political columnist beginning in 1957. While working for Actualité Africaine, he was hired as an informer for the Belgian intelligence service, and in 1958, on the pretext that he was reporting on the Brussels World Fair, he was sent to Belgium on a very important assignment. He was to befriend Patrice Lumumba. In December 1958, Lumumba had become the figurehead of the Congo independence movement when he made a famous speech demanding that Congo be granted self-determination to huge crowds in Kinshasa. In January 1959, capitalizing on his ascendant reputation, Lumumba went to Brussels to introduce himself to the Belgian political elite. It was there that he met Mobutu, and the two men quickly became very close, bonding over their animosity of the Belgians and their desire for a free and independent Congo. So impressed was Lumumba by his companion, who was 5 years his junior, that before long Mobutu had become his personal secretary. He was the ideal aide, engrossing himself into the task at hand by regularly getting up at 5 in the morning and working until 10 p.m., in a job that allowed him to remain in the shadows while also wielding considerable influence. Further outbreaks of civil unrest in Congo between September and December 1959 resulted in the arrest of Lumumba, in combination with general calls for European nations to decolonize, forced the Belgians to negotiate the independence of Congo in Brussels at the Round Table Conference in January 1960. Lumumba was released from jail to participate in talks that lasted from the 20th of January to the 20th of February, which resulted in the independence of Congo on the 30th of June 1960, and the installation of Lumumba as Prime Minister and head of government, while his rival, Joseph Kasavubu, was made ceremonial head of state. The nascent nation, however, was soon dealing with a number of crises. The first, happening within a week of independence, was a general mutiny of the army, which was still being operated and administered by Belgian officers. Believing they were being denied the fruits of independence, the Congolese military took matters into their own hands, demanding salary increases, promotions, and the expulsion of colonial officers from the 4th of July. Ignoring well-founded rumors that he was a Belgian agent, Mobutu was appointed as the army chief of staff in one of Patrice Lumumba's greatest blunders. By sheer force of personality and on multiple occasions at the risk of his own life, Mobutu was able to persuade the mutineers to stay in their barracks, often standing up in front of drunk, pugnacious soldiers with a calm and collected voice as they pointed guns at him and threatened to shoot him. In one of his most impressive interventions, he proved so persuasive that the disaffected lined up so he could take their guns away from them one by one. Congo was plunged into deeper turmoil on the 10th of July and the 11th of July, when, in collaboration with Moise Tshombe and his secessionist Konokat party, the Belgians militarily intervened on the grounds that they were ensuring the safety and well-being of European settlers, which proved little more than a pretext for an invasion of the wealthy copper region of Katanga. Following their lead, within a month, the governor of the neighboring region of South Kasai, famed for its diamonds, also declared its intention to break away from the Congolese fold. The Katanga and South Kasai secessions were deeply problematic for Lumumba, given that both movements enjoyed considerable support from Western governments who feared that Lumumba had ties to the USSR. These governments were further influenced by mining conglomerates still eager to extract African wealth. He was hampered further by the inaction of the United Nations, who, working in concert with Western powers, refused to provide troops to retake the separatist areas. Accepting that he was on his own, Lumumba ordered the Armée Nationale Congolaise, or ANC, to march to South Kasai and Katanga and crush the rebellions. It was to prove another major political mistake, for the embattled Prime Minister's forces completely ravaged South Kasai, committing crimes against humanity that gave Lumumba's internal enemies the excuse they needed to depose him. Responsible for the dishonorable conduct was none other than Mobutu himself, who, as ANC Chief of Staff, had the full operational control of the military campaign in South Kasai. Lumumba made his last and most serious faux pas by turning to the Soviet Union to request transport planes, trucks, and weapons. Duly obliging, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a cadre of Soviet technical advisors who were then installed at all levels of the Congolese government, an intervention that not only marked a dangerous escalation of the Cold War in Africa, but now gave Western powers an easy justification for his removal from office. With both his internal and external opponents on the same page, a vast conspiracy involving Belgium, the USA, the UN, and Mobutu was hatched to get rid of Lumumba. The first move to discredit him was made by his ceremonial president, Kasavubu, who, capitalizing on the massacres of unarmed civilians in South Kasai by the ANC, denounced Lumumba along with the United Nations Secretary-General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who likened the extrajudicial killings against the Lumba populace to a genocide. Deeming him unfit for office, on the 5th of September, Kasavubu announced on national radio that Lumumba had been dismissed, but as the Prime Minister still enjoyed a working majority in both houses of Parliament, he was unable to be removed after receiving votes of confidence. In turn, Lumumba dismissed Kasavubu, but Parliament refused to accept this decision also. Emboldened by the instability, Mobutu, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, was encouraged by his friends to break the deadlock by staging his own coup d'état. On the 14th of September 1960, with the help of the CIA, Mobutu seized power with the ANC, announcing to the country that his intentions were to temporarily neutralize both Lumumba and Kasavubu politically. In reality, this was a coup against Lumumba, who was placed under house arrest, and not Kasavubu, who continued to carry out his official functions. The ousting of the democratically elected Lumumba was given international approval, when at a UN General Assembly, Kasavubu's delegation was recognized as the representative of the Congolese government. Belgian, US, UN, and Congolese officials now began considering ways to prevent the fallen Prime Minister returning to power, a process initiated as early as the 10th of September, when the Belgian Foreign Affairs Minister, Pierre Wigny, wrote ominously to his team at Brazzaville that responsible authorities had the duty to render Lumumba harmless. On the 27th of November, the opportunity to render him harmless came when Lumumba, realizing he could only regain the initiative through popular support, escaped from his bondage in an attempt to link up with his followers gathered at Kisangani. Working in conjunction with Mobutu, on December the 1st, US and Belgian intelligence agencies tracked him down to Lodi, located on the left bank of the Sankuru River. There they apprehended him and flew him back to Kinshasa, where, in the presence of Mobutu, he was brutally beaten. He was then transferred to the Armored Brigade camp at Mbanza Ngungu in the Lower Congo, but even behind bars he remained dangerously influential, as by January 1961, legions of his supporters in Kisangani had begun expanding control and authority in the eastern part of the country, fanning fears of a pro-Lumumba counter-coup. With Lumumba now a liability, a decision was jointly made by the Belgians, Americans, Mobutu, and other Congolese accomplices to assassinate him in an operation masterminded by the Belgians. Accompanied by two companions, Maurice Umpolo, the Youth and Sports Minister, and the Senate Vice President, Joseph Okito, Lumumba was bundled onto a plane heading for the Belgian stronghold of Katanga, and along with his comrades was so severely beaten by members of the Luba tribe, eager to exact revenge for the slaughter of their kinsman in South Kasai, that the Belgian aircrew had to shut themselves up in the cockpit to drown out the noise. Landing at Luano Airport in Lubumbashi, he was tortured and assaulted for hours by Katanga leaders and Belgian officers, shot by execution squad, and then in the final grisly step, his body was dissolved in acid. With Lumumba out of the picture, Mobutu and 4 other statesmen formed a shadowy political clique known as the Binza Group that was responsible for every major decision made by the government between 1960 to 1965. It was comprised of the individuals that had control of the 5 most important departments of government, namely the military, the security police, the foreign ministry, the central bank, and the internal affairs apparatus. These agencies were run by Joseph Mobutu, Victor Ndaka, Justin Bomboko, Albert Ndele, and Damien Kandolo. Together they worked closely with the American, Belgian, and UN officials to impose their will on the succession of weak civilian governments formed after the January 1961 assassination, and to eradicate from the political scene the rest of Patrice Lumumba's supporters. One of their first achievements was quelling the secessionist revolts in South Kasai and Katanga, which were concluded in July 1962 and January 1963 respectively, the latter with the assistance of UN troops. Then, due to continued heavy-handed tactics by government officials, widespread popular discontent led to 2 armed insurrections against the government by the end of 1963 that enveloped the western, northeastern, and eastern portions of the nation. The first uprisings, which centered around the west and northeast, were coordinated by Pierre Mulele, the first prominent Lumumbist to return to Congo after having spent the last 15 months training in revolutionary guerrilla warfare in the People's Republic of China. In the opening stages, Mulele scored a dramatic victory against Mobutu and the Binza Group by successfully seizing a large segment of Kwilu province, during which he was celebrated for killing an army colonel and commander. Legendary among his compatriots, Mulele became so popular among the revolutionary fighters that it was commonly believed he had invented a magic formula that transformed bullets into water. However, unable to expand his territorial gains, the revolution lost its urgency, with Mulele and his commanders making little progress in the Kwilu bush over the next 5 years. In August 1968, having gone to Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo for medical treatment, he was lured back to Kinshasa by the Binza Group on false promises of reconciliation. When he arrived on the 8th of October 1968, he was immediately apprehended and murdered in a horrifying display of brutality, which was a glimpse of the horrors Mobutu was capable of. Later on, when he had consolidated his hold on the country, Mobutu became more subtle with his methods, preferring to bribe his enemies into submission. The second revolt, headed by pro-Lumumbist Christopher Gobenye, was different to the Mulele uprising in that the main tactic was to use large-scale military offenses to capture key towns and cities, rather than to wage a protracted guerrilla war in the countryside. Like Mulele's, at first Gobenye's insurgency, mainly carried out by drug-addled gangs of youths calling themselves the Simbas, was extremely successful because it was able to secure large swathes of land covering more than the entire eastern half of the Congo. However, disorder soon swept their conquered territories, and the popular mandate was lost as the unruly Simbas massacred large numbers of professionals, intellectuals, and unarmed civilians in drug-fueled rampages. The Simba Revolt, which was largely financed by Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union, was finally put down by an American-funded counterinsurgency, Operation Dragon Rouge. With all pro-Lumumbists neutralized and the situation largely pacified, moderates outside the Binza Group, led by President Kasavubu, then attempted to make a fledgling parliamentary democracy. In 1964, a new constitution was ratified, and during May 1965, the first non-violent national elections were conducted since independence. Although showing promising signs that Congo had the potential of becoming a working democracy, a general consensus arose among Western powers that a chaotic parliamentary system wouldn't adequately defend their own commercial and geopolitical interests well enough. Instead, a strongman readily available was needed to keep everything from falling apart. And so on the 24th of November 1965, with the backing of Western sponsors and the support of a populace fatigued by constant war, Joseph Mobutu took over the central government by promising that within 5 years he would hand governmental control back to civilians. In the words of one biographer, no other president had been presented with a country of such potential yet achieved so little. No other leader had plundered his economy so effectively or lived a high life to such excess. Between 1965 and 1997, Joseph Mobutu presided over one of modern Africa's most corrupt, amoral and venal regimes. The Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution, or MPR, established on the 20th of May 1967, became the primary instrument of ideological control and political stability in Mobutu's Congo. It was the vehicle through which he formalized his lifelong rule in 1970, when he declared himself chairman of the party and head of all the country's political institutions indefinitely. Mobutu maintained his power by crushing political and popular dissent, with an overlapping web of military, paramilitary and security wings, and by keeping potential rivals at bay with sizable bribes. For the latter purpose, he had around 400 very lucrative government positions whose office holders he made sure to regularly rotate to ensure everyone got a share of the spoils. And he endlessly reshuffled his cabinet, resulting in 51 different governments between 1965 to 1990. Ministerial posts were the most sought after, offering incumbents access to the choice of 2 luxury cars that were usually stolen by the end of their stint, over-generous travel allowances that could be blown on expensive goods, and bank loans that didn't have to be repaid. Joseph Mobutu's 32-year reign was marked above all by the gross economic mismanagement of his country, whose vast resources were pilfered and then transferred to the dictator and his inner circle at the expense of his impoverished populace. Driven by base, insatiable greed, Congo was financially devastated in part because Mobutu knew absolutely nothing about economics and found the topic extremely boring, his eyes often glazing over when the subject came up in governmental meetings. He hated it so much that when it was mentioned in conversation, he would change the topic. And when he was given an economic document, he wouldn't even bother looking through it before handing it off to an aide to deal with. Not interested in carefully listening to honest advisors about promising long-term economic plans, Mobutu gradually replaced them with sycophantic yes-men who only offered him quick-fix solutions that hadn't been properly examined and which, when enacted, only wrecked the economy even more. Mobutu ultimately allowed his entourage to do what they liked with the state treasury because he could log the offenders' illicit activities with the intelligence services so that, if necessary, he could later blackmail them. For 32 years, Mobutu presided over a broken state riddled with the most abusive forms of corruption, but he was ultimately able to cling on to the top job for so long because of the support of the USA, Belgium, and other Western benefactors. For the USA, whose main Cold War directive was to combat communist ideology wherever it developed, he was viewed as the strongman that Congo needed to stay together so that it, and indeed the whole of Central Africa, could more effectively fight off the advances of communism. For the Belgians as well as the Americans, maintaining a cooperative relationship with Congo was good press because it reinforced their own credibility as reliable international partners. The product of 5 years of political crisis, Mobutu inherited a nation mired in economic turmoil, in which gross domestic product, commercialized production, and agricultural exports had fallen off a cliff. His biggest obstacle was dealing with the results of an unfair treaty with Belgium, who on the eve of independence had not only dumped much of their external debt onto Congo, but who had stolen many of the assets that rightfully belonged to Congo by forcing them to legally transfer the state investment portfolio over to them. This put Mobutu, who was backed by Belgian patrons, in an awkward position, necessitating a strategy in which he served his puppet master's interests while at the same time adopting an antagonistic public stance against them. To challenge Belgian economic hegemony, Mobutu passed the 1966 Bakajika Law, which decreed that the state rightfully owned all land and mineral deposits, following this up in January 1967 with the nationalization of Congo's biggest mining company, UMHK, which was rechristened Gécamine. On the other hand, following Belgium's imposition of a copper embargo and economic sanctions, the agreement was altered so that a sister company of the UMHK was granted management, processing and marketing contracts, resulting in the strengthening of Belgium's hold and illustrating that despite his anti-Western rhetoric, the unprincipled Mobutu was perfectly happy to collaborate with them when necessary. Between 1968 and 1972, the only period of economic growth in his entire reign, stimulated by political stability and a hike in international copper demand as a result of the Vietnam War, it was mainly the Congolese gentry who reaped the rewards. Over this period, the Mobutu administration mainly invested in mining and manufacturing, while allocating disproportionately smaller funds to the sectors that would help normal Congolese the most, namely agriculture, transportation, health and education. The economic upturn coincided with Mobutu's first major national project, which took the form of an authenticity campaign designed to reunify the nation after the divisive 1960s. Launched in 1971, Congo was renamed Zaire, a word that derived from the Kikongo word for the Congo River, in line with Mobutu's vision of a modern and united Congo that would be built around a framework of ancestral and spiritual values as opposed to the Western materialism model that had been imposed on the country for the majority of its modern history. A new currency, also called Zaire, was introduced. The flag and national anthem were changed, the statues of Belgian monarchs were toppled, Belgian roads, buildings and cities were given African names, and formal greetings such as Madame and Monsieur were substituted with citoyen and citoyenne. The sweeping reforms even applied to the sartorial realm, where the European suit was banned in favor of a high-collared jacket personally designed by the autocrat, and provocative Western clothing such as the miniskirt was replaced with traditional African dresses. He resorted to spectacle to achieve his aims, most notably in 1974 when Kinshasa hosted the Rumble in the Jungle world heavyweight boxing match between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali, an international Black Pride event Mobutu hoped would translate into an uptick in national pride. Alongside the measures, Mobutu made moves to place himself right at the ideological heart of the unifying doctrine of authenticity through a process akin to self-deification. As Zaire germinated, so too did an extravagant personality cult that began referring to him as the guide, the helmsman, father of the nation, and founding president, with some officials even comparing him to the Messiah. Like an omnipotent being, his face was plastered on every newspaper, and at the beginning of the daily television news broadcast, his features would emerge godlike from a nimbus of clouds. Despite his best attempts, however, Mobutu's personality cult never caught on, being largely met by the masses well acquainted with state propaganda from the colonial era, with indifference and apathy. In contrast, the ancillary economic campaign, known as Zairianization, had a much longer-lasting and devastating effect on society. In 1973, Mobutu announced that all foreign-owned farms, plantations and commercial enterprises were to be turned over to the state, with departing businessmen compensated. Setting out no guidelines for division of spoils, a mad scramble for the best assets and properties was set in motion, resulting in the redistribution of thousands of businesses totaling over $1 billion among the Zairian elite, in the most comprehensive nationalization ever seen in Africa. By the end, Mobutu had seized 14 plantations, merging them together in a conglomerate that had over 25,000 employees to make it the third biggest employer in the country. With the stolen revenues, he greatly expanded his property portfolio, buying 9 residences in upmarket districts of Brussels, a $5.2 million villa in France, a $2.3 million estate in Portugal, an enormous apartment in Paris conveniently located next to the furrier who crafted his signature leopard skin hat, and various properties in Cape Town, Madrid, Marrakesh, Abidjan and Dakar. He also built an extravagant palace for himself at his home village of Gadabolite, a presidential villa in almost every town and city, and multiple accommodations in Kinshasa, including a hillside mansion with a private zoo. As for the rest of his henchmen, he made sure that all the ethnic groups he counted on for support received their fair due. Instead of operating their acquired businesses in a sensible manner, the Congolese elite, unfamiliar with how to run an efficient organization and not interested in doing so, squeezed them for every drop of cash. To paraphrase one contemporary, they were giving cattle herds to people who couldn't tell a bull from a cow. Ordinary Congolese citizens could only watch on in horror as businesses closed, prices skyrocketed, stock was emptied and sold, and jobs were doled out on nepotistic lines. Most of the revenue was pocketed by the new owners who spent their proceeds on luxury items, illustrated by the fact that imports of Mercedes-Benz hit an all-time African record just 1 year after Zairianization. The result of this state-sponsored banditry and the funneling off of most of its resources out of the country was that very little was left to spend on important sectors such as infrastructure, health and education, which deteriorated so rapidly that by 1975, living standards began to gradually decline, while thousands of children every year continue to die from preventable and easily curable diseases like malaria, measles and dysentery. Rampant crime spread across the nation, and in one instance, in a slip made during a live television broadcast, Mobutu could be heard telling employees to "go ahead and steal as long as you don't take too much." The immediate effects on the economy, which had been growing at an average of 7% a year before Zairianization, were devastating. And from 1974, the economy began a slow, steady decline that it never recovered from. Mobutu had also picked the worst time to financially ravage his nation, as global prices for copper, one of Congo's most profitable exports, fell by 2/3, while concomitantly, oil prices nearly quadrupled. Realizing the Pandora's box he had opened, Mobutu desperately tried to appeal to former owners by paying them some compensation and offering them majority shares, but no one was willing to invest. The blow to Mobutu's credentials as a leader as a result of Zairianization was so catastrophic that he would never again try to coat his regime with an ideological sheen. For the rest of his time in office, Mobutu shored up his position through bare and often brutal pragmatism, only being concerned with what was necessary to keep him in power and allow him to make money. It was with this mindset that he approached potential threats to his rule, the first being a student-led democracy movement called Union Générale des Étudiants Congolais, or UGEC. During his first few years as president, Mobutu initially got along well with the student populace, but the cordial relationship began to sour following a UGEC proclamation in October 1966, in which representatives unanimously agreed that Congo should be transformed into a socialist state, organized around the principles of democratic centralism. An uneasy peace was maintained until January 1968, when UGEC leaders and members staged a number of protests in Kinshasa in response to the state visit of US Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey and his decision to go to the monument of Patrice Lumumba, whose murder his country had been complicit in. The demonstration, which involved the tossing of tomatoes and eggs, so greatly embarrassed Mobutu, whose supremacy was sponsored by the USA, that 12 days later he denounced ringleader André Nkanza Dolomingu, a Princeton graduate, as a foolish troublemaker. The student body's resistance to the regime met a bloody end on the 4th of June 1969 in Kinshasa, when soldiers opened fire on crowds of students who had been peacefully protesting. More than 60 demonstrators were shot, after which Mobutu expelled all students and imposed strict censorship. 2 years later, when students held a memorial for their fallen comrades, Mobutu punished participants by forcing them to enlist in the armed forces, following this up with the founding of a single national university. By 1971, with the MPR recognized as the only legal political party, and with student opposition stifled, very few of Mobutu's enemies remained inside the country. As a result, between 1969 and 1980, most of his critics, who were often former members of past Congolese governments, were based outside of Congo in exile. One of the biggest nuisances in this regard was MARC, founded in 1974 in Brussels by deserters of his regime. In a masterclass of Machiavellian machinations, in 1978 Mobutu defeated them by implicating them in a plot to overthrow the government, resulting in the execution of 13 of their acolytes and the sentencing to death of the movement's leaders in absentia. A couple of weeks later, having allegedly been lured into a Brussels apartment by a female secret agent, one of its founders, Kanyonga Mobatelli, was found shot dead in a mafia-style killing. While a simple but lethal solution was enough to stop MARC in its tracks, a more complex approach, requiring a much higher budget, was needed to thwart the FLNC, a Marxist armed opposition group based in neighboring Angola that mainly consisted of Congolese refugees, many of whom had fought on Moise Tshombe's side during the Katanga cessation of the 1960s. When the FLNC first invaded Congo in 1977, Mobutu relied on his armed forces, an organization so riven by corruption that most ordinary troops were demotivated and ill-disciplined. He did not even trust his top brass, going so far as to arrest a cabal of senior officers from the central Taleta region in 1975 for plotting a takeover. Thus it came as no surprise when in 1977, in what would become known as the First Shaba War, the Congolese military, renamed Forces Armées Zaïroises or FAZ, proved utterly incapable of doing their job. That year, FLNC chiefs assaulted Katanga province, which had been renamed Shaba, routed Mobutu's army, and captured the mining town of Kolwezi, their strategy being to hold on to the mineral-rich region for as long as possible in order to strangle the economy of Kinshasa. With the FAZ on the ropes, the regime was only saved by financial and military assistance, provided by stalwart anti-communist governments in the USA and Morocco. The following year, the FLNC defeated the FAZ and seized Kolwezi again in the Second Shaba War, with Mobutu only rescued from disaster with the intervention of the Belgian and French armies. In a repeat of 1975, the ever-paranoid Mobutu once again purged the top echelons of the military on the pretext that they were planning a coup, with 13 people executed and more than 200 officers from Kasai, Bandundu and Shaba removed. Dependent on foreign powers to fight his wars and to save him at the last moment, Deus ex machina style, the Shaba conflicts illustrated Mobutu's embarrassing over-reliance on Western armed forces. Military humiliations in combination with the criminal mishandling of the economy, the further impoverishment of the populace, and calls from the USA to implement meaningful liberalization reforms put pressure on the regime for the first time. In 1977, Mobutu gave in by holding the freest parliamentary elections of his tenure, in which candidates were not hand-picked by the MPR, enabling more unorthodox and independently minded individuals to enter the political stage. For the next 3 years, this dissident flock of parliamentarians monitored the work of the executive closely, exercised forceful oversight over the matters of government, and took advantage of question and answer sessions to field uncomfortable questions about the conduct of Mobutu's administration. They even went as far as publicly denouncing the July 1979 massacre, ordered by Mobutu, of illegal diamond operators in eastern Kasai, and asked for an independent inquiry. In December 1980, though, with Washington distracted by Cold War flare-ups in the Horn of Africa and Afghanistan, Mobutu jailed, tortured or banished to remote detention centers the 13 politicians who had signed a 52-page letter demanding political reforms. Throughout the 1980s, this cadre of political rebels, led by Tshisekedi wa Mulumba, came to be known as the Group of 13, and would in time spearhead the third and most threatening Congolese democracy movement. This picked up speed in 1982 when, during a brief respite from detention, the Group of 13 defied Mobutu's ban on political opposition to create their own party, Union pour la démocratie et le progrès social, or UPDS, which became instantly popular despite being technically illegal. In 1988, the UPDS chose the anniversary of Patrice Lumumba's assassination, January the 17th, to stage unprecedented pro-democracy protests at the Kasavubu Bridge in Kinshasa. In addition to reinvigorated opposition, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which presaged the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, worked against Mobutu, who had only been able to hold on to the reins of power for so long because the Americans had kept him in place as an African bulwark against communism. In January 1990, Mobutu relented to internal pressures and to the realities of the changing global geopolitical landscape by announcing the launch of an exercise called Popular Consultations, in which Congolese citizens were permitted to complain about their grievances and issues with the state to a local special commissioner. The mood of the general public became apparent during the question and answer sessions, during which many boldly told Mobutu to his face that he was entirely responsible for the country's woes, showing that the populace no longer feared him. With reluctance, on the 24th of April 1990, Mobutu announced that he was scrapping the one-party state, marking the start of his long and gradual downfall. The most prominent pro-democracy parties to emerge in this period was the Union Sacrée, or Sacred Union, a combination of the 5 leading opposition groups, yet only 2 of the 5, the UPDS of Tshisekedi wa Malumba and the Parti Lumumbiste Unifié, or PDSC, were genuine in their pro-democracy stance, while the other 3, the UFERI, UDI and FNC, were pro-Mobutu parties in disguise. Taking advantage of the massive profusion of new parties, the placement of the loyalist UFERI, UDI and FNC within the Sacred Union was part of a larger strategy involving the setup of fake opposition parties to dilute the support of the real opposition. With 204 parties having been created by July 1991, however, even Mobutu could not turn back the tide. When the Sacred Union successfully pressurized him into holding a sovereign national conference in August, in which all the newly enfranchised factions could come together to iron out their differences. On the 7th of August 1991, the long-awaited Conférence Nationale Souveraine, or CNS, convened for the first time, only to be disrupted in September when unpaid soldiers started looting and pillaging Kinshasa. Taking back the initiative, Mobutu had the CNS abruptly closed on the 9th of January 1992. The sudden end to a congregation that had promised a brighter, more representative future spurred Catholic priests and other religious groups to encourage the nation's Christians to come together on Sunday the 16th of February and demonstrate against the premature conclusion of the CNS. In response to the largely peaceful march, Mobutu's paramilitary forces opened fire on the throngs in Kinshasa, resulting in the deaths of 30 people. However, widespread revulsion for the brutal killings and the elevation of those sacrificed into martyrs of democracy forced Mobutu to reopen the conference, which reconvened between the 6th of April and the 6th of December 1992 and featured a total of 2,842 people in conference, representing all levels of Congolese society. Their principal aim was to take stock of Congo's history since independence, in order to better understand how the country had fallen into its wretched state. Between May and mid-June, hundreds of speeches outlining general policy statements by political parties were delivered and broadcast via national radio and television, and after that a commission was set up to sort out their minor and major themes. The subjects were so broad they covered almost every aspect of Congolese life and society, ranging from assassination, ill-gotten property, economic policy, political structures and even minority rights, which were then more closely examined by special subcommittees assigned to each topic. It was hoped that from this process a new list of state policies, a constitution for the new Third Republic, and a provisional constitution for the period of democratic transition could be put together. Mobutu did everything in his power to impede progress and frustrate pro-democracy advocates. This included blocking the reports on assassination and ill-gotten property to spare him embarrassment. He also interrupted the public reading of the Political Affairs Commission report for the same reason. From these negotiations was patched together an agreement called Le Compromis Politique Global, or Comprehensive Political Compromise, outlining a 2-year plan in which a government and parliament was to be elected by the CNS, while Mobutu stayed on as ceremonial president. On the other hand, Mobutu made sure to make the charter as vague as possible, leaving room for him to exploit various loopholes he would later use to his advantage. As soon as the compromise was transformed into the Provisional Constitution on the 4th of August 1992, the dictator got to work undermining the democratic transition by attempting to remove Tshisekedi wa Mulumba, the leader of the UPDS, as prime minister. At first, Mobutu tried to achieve his aims through terror by firebombing the UPDS's headquarters a couple of days before the prime minister's vote on the 14th of August, in the hopes that their members would react violently, thus giving him the excuse he needed to declare a state of emergency, close the CNS conference and take back control. When UPDS members did not take the bait and stayed calm, Mobutu next tried to dislodge Tshisekedi by sponsoring a rival candidate, Thomas Kanza, and bribing CNS delegates for votes. His ploy, however, did not work, and Tshisekedi was chosen as prime minister with 71% of the vote in an election seen as the freest and most democratic in Congo's history, despite the despot's meddling. Over the next 3 months, the relationship between Mobutu and the prime minister deteriorated rapidly, as both sought to obstruct the other. Taking advantage of the nebulous wording of the CNS charter, which hadn't clearly stated that the old constitution was invalid, Mobutu pounced on this ambiguity to argue that the old constitution was technically still valid. The old dictator also undermined the new government by deploying his paramilitaries when necessary. When Tshisekedi appointed a new governor of the central bank, for example, Mobutu sent in elite troops to encircle the bank with tanks to prevent his personal bank account from being seized. A near breakdown in their relations then came between 1992 and 1993, when Tshisekedi's home province of Eastern Kasai, motherland of the marginalized Luba people, was subject to a campaign of ethnic cleansing condoned by Mobutu that resulted in the deaths of over 5,000 people when the region refused to use a new currency issued by Kinshasa. These were the events that compelled Mobutu to carry out the third military coup of his career on the 1st of December 1992. In January 1993, Mobutu successfully persuaded all CNS military officers to side with him, leading to an eruption of violence in Kinshasa, during which Mobutu's paramilitaries fought against government forces. Taking advantage of a clause in the CNS charter which stated that the old parliament was only in recess and hadn't been dissolved, in March 1993, Mobutu recalled his government, creating a situation in which Congo now had 2 separate constitutions and legislatures. At the urging of internal and external mediators, both belligerents agreed to enter into discussions in September 1993, resulting in the ratification of a single institutional framework. The dual authority structure was removed in January 1994, with the establishment of a single legislature, composed mostly of members of Mobutu's National Assembly, while a single fundamental law was introduced on the 9th of April 1994 with the promulgation of the Constitutional Act of the Transition. Installed as Prime Minister was Léon Lobich Kengo, a fellow Ngbandi tribesman and Mobutu protégé. The new administration, the Haut Conseil de la République Parlement de Transition, or HCRPT, was presented to the people as another transitional government whose aim was to establish a multi-party, democratic Third Republic via national elections by 1997. In reality, it did everything in its power to ignore the Constitutional Act of Transition, which stipulated that all matters of national importance had to be decided by consensus, a proviso that was continuously violated by the use of majority rule rather than unanimous agreement to make important decisions. Mobutu and his ministers further sabotaged the CNS by engaging in electoral preparation activities that only the CNS was allowed to carry out, drafting electoral reforms without consulting them and starving them of financial resources. By mid-August 1996, 11 months away from the supposed democratic transition, it looked increasingly unlikely that Mobutu and his henchmen would fulfill their promise of creating a Third Republic. On the other hand, while Mobutu had successfully and carefully suppressed internal attempts to remove him, he had gravely underestimated the external factors that would ultimately lead to his downfall, namely the after-effects of the Rwandan genocide. In perhaps the most horrific genocide of the 20th century after the Holocaust, in 1994, Hutu tribesmen of neighboring Rwanda systematically murdered between 800,000 to 1 million of their Tutsi countrymen. The slaughter was a direct result of decades of ethnic tensions artificially created by the Western powers that had presided over Rwanda, namely Germany and then Belgium, whose colonial administrations had viewed the Tutsi, the traditional ruling class of Rwanda, as superior to the Hutu. The 1994 genocide was ultimately sparked when the Hutu president, Habyarimana, flying back from a sub-regional summit in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, in the presidential plane alongside the Hutu president of Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, was shot down on April 4, 1994, either by Tutsi forces or more likely by Hutu extremists in his own entourage, looking for a justification for the mass killing of Tutsis and moderate Hutus. He was a close friend of Mobutu, and upon hearing the news, Mobutu spent the night in tears, fearful for the future. By June 1994, the Hutu perpetrators had been driven back by Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Army, or RPA, to the region of Kivu in eastern Congo, where, with Mobutu's backing, they were allowed to establish enormous bases, carry out cross-border raids into Rwanda, and from late 1996, ethnically cleanse Congo-based Tutsi. For many African leaders, Mobutu's decision to shelter Hutu terrorists and stoke the flames of inter-ethnic conflict in the region was the final straw. At the instigation of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, a multinational alliance known as the Alliance of Democratic Forces, or AFDL, a coalition of 4 Congolese revolutionary groups working in tandem with Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Zambia, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and later Angola, was formed to depose him. The man selected to replace Mobutu and who would lead the column of rebels to Kinshasa was Laurent Désiré Kabila, a former Congolese guerrilla commander who had for the past decade, in an obscure corner of eastern Zaire, made a living as an ivory and diamond trader. The plan was set in motion on the 6th of October 1996 when the RPA crossed over into Congo to destroy the Hutu strongholds in lockstep with the AFDL. Within a month and a half, the Hutu extremists and FAZ had been driven from the camp towns of Kivu, opening the way for the AFDL to make their way across the country to Kinshasa. Over the next 6 months, with throngs of child soldiers at his back, Kabila's forces and the Rwandan and Ugandan armies moved from one village to the next, shamelessly raping, looting and murdering Hutus in revenge as the Congolese army disintegrated. Meanwhile, holed up in his palace at Gdabolit, Mobutu desperately appealed to his few African friends and former Western allies, France, Belgium and the USA, to intervene, but to no avail, forcing him to resort to hiring white mercenaries, many of them Serbian perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide, to make up for the failings of the FAZ, whose ineffective chief of staff was soon replaced with a much more able and popular general, Dona Lieko Mahele. All the while, Mobutu ailed with prostate cancer that had been diagnosed after a routine health check in a Swiss clinic in Lausanne in August 1996. As a consequence of the draining radiotherapy treatment he was going through, Mobutu's decision-making became erratic and slow, his entourage looking on in bemusement as he time and time again failed to make split-second decisions that could save him. During his last few months in Zaire, Mobutu retired to a modest villa located near the border with the neighboring Republic of Congo, surrounded himself with his family and shutting out his political advisors and distrustful generals. Despite his poor health and to the disbelief of the American and Congolese envoys urging him to hand over power to Kabila, Mobutu still clung onto the hope that he could negotiate a solution to the present predicament. He had become so out of touch with events on the ground that on the 29th of April 1997, it was the American delegation that had to inform him that the last major town on the way to Kinshasa had fallen. On the 4th of May, the weakened president, who was too frail to climb the steep metal steps leading from the quayside to the deck by himself, had a face-to-face meeting with Kabila aboard a South African vessel docked in the neutral port city of Pointe-Noire, located in the Republic of Congo. Talks quickly broke down as the two men refused to budge on anything, making an ominous final showdown between the AFDI and Mobutu's FAZ in Kinshasa seem inevitable. However, the bloodbath was prevented when it was revealed that General Mahele, the head of the FAZ, had betrayed Mobutu and was planning to swear allegiance to Kabila. 24 hours after telling the despot that it was now impossible to win, Mahele, a man admired by ordinary Zairians for opening fire on looting soldiers, was shot in an assassination orchestrated by Mobutu. Any hopes of resisting the rebel push faded with Mahele's demise, which met with widespread anger, turned the rest of the population and his last remaining loyalists against Mobutu. Even members of Mobutu's extended family abandoned him, with a cousin, General Nzimbi, organizing a foiled plot to down the presidential jet with a surface-to-air missile from the back of a jeep as it made its way to Gadabolit. Having taken an alternative route to get there in order to avoid being shot out of the sky, once they arrived at Gadabolit, Mobutu and his family soon made arrangements to flee the country, when they realized they were no longer safe. When the crew of the presidential plane refused to transport him on the grounds that the plane was state property, the family were forced to borrow a Russian Ilyushin cargo plane. On the 17th of May 1997, the presidential family hurriedly piled into a plane to be whisked off into exile in Togo. As it took off, rebel soldiers fired on it, but the bullets only penetrated the bodywork. When they landed, the Togolese dictator and one of Mobutu's oldest friends, Gnassingbé Eyadema, refused to shelter them, and so on the 23rd of May they made their way to Morocco, where after a month the ejected tyrant was admitted to Avicenne Hospital in Rabat for emergency surgery. On the 7th of September 1997, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, once the revered strongman of Congo, died as a result of complications from prostate cancer. Born into one of the most rapacious colonial regimes in Africa, Joseph Désiré Mobutu spent the first part of his life with his mother and stepfather on the estate of an affluent Belgian judge and his wife, who took him under her wing and treated him like he was one of her own. With the death of his stepfather, Mobutu roamed around the country with his mother, going from relative to relative until he was taken in by his uncle. At school he excelled at sports as well as academics, until he was thrown out and forced to join the Force Publique after he ran away from Leopoldville, the capital of the Belgian Congo. The ill-disciplined troublemaker was straightened out by the rigors of military life, but he soon discovered a greater calling as a journalist, opting to pursue a career as a writer rather than extending his army service when the opportunity arose in 1957. Whilst working for the magazine Actualité Africaine, he was hired as an informer for the Belgian intelligence service, which was on the hunt for allies to serve their interests as calls for an independent Congo grew stronger. Whilst in Brussels, Mobutu befriended the figurehead of the movement, Patrice Lumumba, who appointed him as his personal secretary as discussions with the Belgians were underway. Following independence on the 30th of June 1960, Mobutu was instated as the chief of staff of the Congolese army, in order to quell a nationwide military revolt. On the 14th of September 1960, he launched a coup d'etat, and then afterwards, while working in collaboration with Belgium and the USA, he played a hand in the brutal murder of Lumumba. For the next 5 years, as a senior member of the shadowy political clique, the Binza Group, Mobutu pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Then, with the support of Western benefactors keen to halt the spread of communism, he pulled off a second coup d'etat on the 24th of November 1965. After brutally putting down the pro-Lumumbist Twiela and Simba rebellions by 1968, Mobutu consolidated his power with an iron fist, massacring pro-democracy students the next year and establishing the MPR as the only legal political party in 1970. To reunify the nation after the turbulent 60s, he embarked on his first and most ambitious national project in the form of the Authenticity Campaign, which de-westernized the country and renamed it Zaire. The subsidiary economic campaign, Zairianization, however, was a complete disaster. the country's vast resources being systematically appropriated and plundered by Mobutu and his greedy Zairean elite. By the late 1970s, the Zairean army's embarrassing performance in the Shaba Wars, in combination with irreversible economic decline caused by Zaireanization and American pressure, forced him to hold the freest election of his tenure in 1977. However, by 1980, when the international spotlight was off Zaire, Mobutu reaffirmed power by purging all pro-democracy advocates. Throughout the 1980s, with his popularity at an all-time low, Mobutu's supremacy was challenged by the growth of a dissident democratic movement, the UPDS, ultimately culminating in enormous pro-democracy protests in 1988. By 1990, following the collapse of international communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, he could no longer rely on the Americans to keep him in office, forcing him into a series of democratic concessions. That year, he abolished the one-party state, promising a transition to democracy that would start with the convening of a sovereign national conference. However, Mobutu did everything he could to sabotage the process and the democratically elected government, resulting in his third and final coup d'etat on December 1, 1992. Mobutu, however, was ultimately dethroned by a fatal political miscalculation. Choosing to shelter and assist perpetrators of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in 1996 an international alliance of African states and Congolese revolutionary groups, the AFDL, was formed to extirpate Hutu extremists in eastern Congo and to depose Mobutu. Over the next 7 months, as Mobutu was dying from prostate cancer, his army was routed, with Laurent Désiré Kabila's forces closing in on Kinshasa by May 1997. No longer safe in his own country, Mobutu and his family fled to Togo and then to Morocco, where on the 7th of September 1997 he died from his illness. What do you think of Joseph Désiré Mobutu? Do you think he cared for his country at all? Or do you think he was only driven by self-interest? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.